Good day to you. You know, communication educators like myself are really interested in how words change in their meaning over time. And words are also often representing concepts. When I think of words like sick, when I think of words like dope, when I think of words like cool, those words have all been rejuvenated, if you want to think of it that way. They've all been given a much more pleasant meaning today. If you say that's a sick car, it has a whole different meaning than saying that person looks sick, if you might have said that in the 1940s. So those words have been rejuvenated much more positively. And it is with that kind of introduction that I'm going to introduce our subject matter for today, because the word queer has also undergone a similar rejuvenation. If you think of the word queer, you may be thinking to yourself it's analogous to the word strange, which is to say that something that is queer is strange and is therefore abnormal. It's outside of normalcy. That's not the way that we're talking about queer analysis today. We're taking on queer analysis as an extension of feminist analysis, as an extension of psychoanalytic theory based on Freud. We're going to start with sexuality. We're going to start with sexuality when we're taking on queer theory, and we're going to be drawing from a bunch of different fields. Queer theory is not coming from sociology or psychology. It's coming from a lot of fields, so we call it an interdisciplinary perspective. And that interdisciplinary perspective is trying to disrupt the socially constructed meanings out there that are surrounding sexuality. It's not just trying to enlighten people as to the meanings that are existing out there that need to be thought of in different ways. It's trying to disrupt the system. It's a very aggressive kind of theory, so to speak. And it does start with sexuality, which is the attraction to another person based on their gender, which again, that's how you are socially constructed in terms of the way that you communicate and you behave according to your sex. That's what gender is. People are attracted to that, and they are also attracted to your sex as well. And so that is what sexuality is all about. Essentially what queer analysts are trying to point out is that there is a binary that needs to be smashed. And this binary is a binary between two polar opposites. At the one end, you have heterosexuality, and at the other end, you have homosexuality. And we're going to be deconstructing that term today, homosexuality. Queer theorists say these are inappropriate terms, that sexuality is much more fluid. It's much more complicated than just two terms. And so when we use these terms, it doesn't do us any favors in trying to understand sexuality. And they say that this binary that exists actually ends up in creating a heteronormativity. Heteronormativity, there's a new word for it. We're going to be exploring that today. Heteronormativity is not just instances of inequity. Heteronormativity is a system of inequity that is derived from this heterosexual, homosexual binary that continues, according to queer theorists, to exist in our vocabularies and in our media content that is perpetuating heteronormativity. Let's take a look at some of the researchers who have helped establish this analytical theory. The first one up is queer theorist Kosovsky Sedwick. Eve says that heterosexual over time has been portrayed as normal and desirable. If you have attraction to the opposite gender or the opposite sex, it's normal and it's desirable. And in describing heterosexuality that way, therefore, the opposite is also true, according to Sedwick. She says that homosexuality, therefore, is just the opposite. It is not normal. It is not desirable by virtue of heterosexuality being portrayed as desirable. She says that the way that this takes place of making a homosexual not desirable is through sexual othering, and that is privileging heterosexuality over homosexuality. The people who are in homosexuality are people that need to be converted, like some people accuse Chick-fil-A, the restaurant chain, of paying for. Conversion therapy or contributing funds to, I should say, to put it into proper context. It's an idea that people are not realizing that if they are homosexual, there is a way back to normalcy. That's what conversion therapy is saying. And sexual othering, that's not the only way that sexual othering takes place. It takes place through condescending names that people are called, like fag, and these kinds of names that have been used over the year. That's sexual othering. And there actually are many, many derogatory terms for homosexuality, but not for heterosexuality. You don't hear people demeaned by virtue of them having an attraction to the opposite sex. But you can think of all the names for lesbians, for males, for bisexual people who are, when they are called those pejorative names, you can think of many of them, right? But you can't think of probably any of them that put down a heterosexual person. Now let's move on to the next theory. The French philosopher Michael Foucault, Foucault. He has a book called The History of Sexuality. Volume 1 is what we're focusing on here. And he says that sexuality is actually a discursive construction. Discursive means language. Discourse is the relative term that's close to discursive. Discursive and discourse are from the same root there. It means to conduct conversation with each other. And so sexuality is derived from that. It's not something that's innate. We're not born with it. It's derived from the way that we talk about it. And he talked a lot about the 19th century. And the 19th century was when homosexuality started to be portrayed for the first time as perverse. He has a quote, Foucault does. He says that the sodomite had been a temporary aberration. The homosexual was now a species. So the sodomite, somebody who sodomizes somebody else, that's actually the way that some laws codify certain sexual activities that occur before the age of consent, which might be 16, 17, 18, etc. What Foucault is talking about is that in the 19th century, the homosexual now became an identifiable species of person who was treated as abnormal. And he says that this is mainly because of all things class warfare in the 18th century. In the 18th century, the 1700s, there was class warfare. And the only way for the rich people to separate themselves out, I shouldn't say the only way, but one way for rich people to separate themselves out from people who were either in serfdom, that means you were forced into labor, or people who did not have noble blood, commoners. The only way that, one of the ways that rich people, aristocratic people thought that they would separate by themselves is through sexuality. And so they started to assert their own sexuality through their clothes, through their relationships, through affairs with others, trysts, etc., even orgies, that they were that was the province of the rich. If you were rich, you got to do that. It was something that came along with your class. And Foucault pointed out that's when sexuality arose. But in that context, also what arose was the beginnings of starting to portray homosexuality as abnormal. Now let's go on to Judith Butler. She's the next theorist that we want to cover. She has a book called Gender Trouble, and it continues Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. Subversion is to push underneath. And she has a theory of gender performativity. That's what she calls it, gender performativity. And that's where people are acting in accordance with external norms for gender identity, which then produces gender identity as a personal quality. So in other words, she's saying that we look elsewhere. We don't look inside of ourselves. We look elsewhere. We look to religion. We look to the way that people are portrayed in the media, on Modern Family, where they have two homosexual men, for example. We look to those kinds of communiques to then identify inside what our own identity is. We're not drawing that from beginning. And she says that since gender is a series of acts, right? If gender is socially constructed, it's not in one instance, right? It's the way that you conduct yourself in life. So it's a series of acts. Each person always has the potential to do it differently, to do your gender differently, in other words. And that's why you have drag queen performances, or drag performances as they are called. ESU has hosted a few of those, and that's where the one way to look at this from Butler's point of view is that drag performances are disrupting the prevailing socially constructed identity for males who want to dress as women, or males who want to feel what it's like to wear women clothes. And so drag performances are disrupting prevailing identities for both heterosexuals and homosexuals. And Butler says that queer theorists work against the systematic normalization of heterosexuality through events like this to try and disrupt the way that heterosexuality is taken for granted to be portrayed. You can call it doxa in that way, to revert to an earlier term that we talked about. And now to continue on, we're going to talk about two areas of the literature that a number of scholars have contributed to that are talking about the visibility of queerness and visibility in American media. So the first one we're going to take a look at is sexual stereotypes. Sexual stereotypes, that's the first area of queerness and the visibility of queerness in American media. What kind of sexual stereotypes do we see out there? There are three binaries, right? We're smashing binaries the whole way through this class, and these three binaries discuss these stereotypes. So the first binary is the binary of natural versus deviant. Natural versus deviant. Generally speaking, non-heterosexual characters, notice I'm not using the term anymore homosexuals, because that word needs to be rehabilitated, so to speak, rejuvenated, just like queer, just like dope, just like sick, in the views of the authors. But instead we're going to say non-heterosexual, people who are not heterosexual. Those characters are typically in secondary roles in the media, or they are in negative roles. They are agitators. They are causing conflict in the plot line. So you, again, take a show like Modern Family. You can decide for yourself whether the characters on that show are indicating that. That's up for you to decide. We can definitely find this kind of thing going on in older films like Alfred Hitchcock's Rope. In that film, it definitely portrayed homosexualities as deviant. There's something wrong with them, something to be scared of, something harmful about them. So that's the homosexuals are portrayed as natural, heterosexuals are portrayed as natural, non-heterosexuals are portrayed as deviant. That's what that binary says. The next binary is the monogamous versus promiscuous binary, the monogamous versus promiscuous binary. And that's essentially saying that heterosexuals are often treated as being more monogamous in media content. They are together longer, they are married longer, they don't cheat on each other as much as homosexuals, as non-heterosexuals. Non-heterosexuals is linked actually to promiscuity, especially in the gay male genre of media content, portraying gay males as promiscuous people, non-monogamous, not settling down with one person, having sexuality with a lot of different people. That's the binary that we're talking about here. And then finally, under the category of queerness and visibility, when we've got gender clarity versus gender ambiguity. Gender clarity versus gender ambiguity. What this is basically saying is that heterosexuals have, because of the way they are portrayed and the way their society socially constructs that particular identity, they have stable sexuality, and their roles are much more defined. Again, the kinds of rituals that people go through who are heterosexuals are very well defined, right up from the first date to courtship, to talk about sexuality as for getting to first base, second base, third base. That's a metaphor that helps teach people how far you should go before you have sex. And then other customs such as an engagement ring, a marriage ring, that's all very well defined for heterosexuals, but homosexuals, there's that word again, non-heterosexuals, much more ambiguous. How are they supposed to act? Are they portrayed at all as having a consistency to their sexuality? No, they are not. Their sexuality is much more unstable. It's much more fluid. It's much more uncertain in terms of the way that they are acting. I ask you, what are gay males good at to stereotype them? And one of the first things that might be said because of the way they've been portrayed on television is interior design or cooking, right? So this is an example of a stereotype that operates within the realm of making their identity ambiguous, because outside of those two features, what else can you say? If you can say anything about gay males and the way that they're represented, what else can you say? Do you have a clear picture? That's what this point is arguing, that there's ambiguity there. That's when you don't have clearness. All right, now let's move to the second area of queerness and visibility 2. Now, queerness and visibility. We're going to talk about problems with quote-unquote positive representation of non-heterosexuals in the media. So the first area is that visibility and representation are two different concepts. Just because non-heterosexual people appear in media content doesn't mean that the way that they appear is also beneficial to causes of non-heterosexual people. So on the one hand, in media content, visibility has improved. You have many more people on television who are openly gay, Ellen DeGeneres, etc., who no longer conceal that. But at the same time, is the representation of them, is it helpful to building ways of understanding people who are non-heterosexual? And that's where the authors say it is lagged behind. The representation of people is behind. The whole idea of coming out, for example, the idea of coming out, it sets up a person to have this great moment of disclosing their sexuality in public as a drama. So-and-so has finally come out. Okay, why does a person have to have that kind of revealing of something that is probably incrementally emerging and constantly undergoing examination from their part, just as a heterosexual undergoes examination of their own sexuality? Why does there have to be a moment like that? It's dramatized. That's what the authors are saying. So that's one of the problems with queerness in the way that it's represented. And you do have professional, quote, queers, the book says, like Anderson Cooper and Ellen DeGeneres, who I mentioned earlier. And they are communicating a certain dimension of their sexuality by revealing publicly that they are gay. But the question is the representation of them, is it fair to people who are non-heterosexual? That's for you to decide. Now let's go on to discuss these larger issues of consequences of heteronormative media representations. Heteronormativity, that's what we're talking about here. We end up with two basic images of being sexual. We've got the natural monogamous, secure heterosexuals, and then we've got the opposite. We've got the deviant, oversexed, androgynous. Do you know that term, androgynous? You can't see clearly whether a person's male or female. Androgynous homosexuals or non-heterosexuals. Few normal non-heterosexual characters are in the media that people can relate to. And this then, therefore, the authors contend, does not provide resources for somebody who is exploring their sexuality. Their resources are not there in the media for people to explore their sexuality in a healthy manner. Now let's move on to queerness and invisibility. We're talking about the opposite here, and we're going to take on a term that has to do with the male gaze, which we've already studied under feminism. Specifically, we're going to extend queerness and invisibility into talking about the term camp. If something is campy, C-A-M-P, like you're camping, there's a word that has also been rehabilitated, and the quote-unquote fourth persona. Okay, so this draws on the work of two scholars. One is Susan Sontag, and she uses the word camp as a way of seeing the world through stylization. It's a way of seeing the world through stylization. If you go out in the world and your clothes have to match, for example, that's seeing the world through a certain stylization. Do you think about your clothes at all when you go out? People do dress because they are on exhibit. They are performing when they go out. And that's an example of camp, at seeing the world through style. But styling is also created in media content through lighting and through contrast of black versus white in that lighting, and through special effects and through character postures. All of this is what we're talking about when we're talking about camp. So now let's take on the second scholar, and that's Jack Bubisio, and he says that camp is the elements in a person or a situation that express gay sensibility. So he's talking about gay sensibility as a characteristic that everybody has: males, females, men, women, people who are homosexual or non-heterosexual, people who are heterosexual, people who are bisexual, or people who are trisexual, if you want to use that word, that there is a gay, socially constructed sensibility that exists in all people, and that sensibility is what film often taps into, and that's where we're going to get to the fourth persona in a few minutes, so bear with us for a moment now. So gay sensibility, according to Bubisio, is an awareness of human complications of feeling that spring from being gay. It's the awareness of the complications of feeling that spring from being gay. That's gay sensibility. It consists of these elements. Furthermore, it consists of irony. When something is ironic, it's reflecting back on itself, and it's having an opposite meaning of what it's supposed to be. You could say you were the first in line, but you got the ticket last because, ironically, they were giving tickets out to the last person. And that's where irony is. So there's irony in gay sensibility. There's theatricality. That's drama. That's acting. That's conflict. That's resolution. There's humor. Humor is also part of the gay sensibility. And there is aestheticism. which is going to take us now to the fourth persona and something known as the textual wink. The fourth persona and textual wink. So the fourth persona is where the author of a text, and when I say author of a text, I mean the person who creates media content, producer, director, scriptwriter, actor. It's when the author of a text provides an impression only some of the audience will notice. That's why it's called a wink. Like when you wink to somebody on the side, you wink to somebody only they see, right? Like I'm kidding, right? I'm putting this other person on. I'm leading them down a teasing expedition. You know that, but they don't know it because I've just winked at you. That's what's going on with the fourth persona and the textual wink. So the film, in particular, but also television and other kinds of media content, position the audience to be a fourth person. And they're the fourth person who only gets the wink if they're looking for it. People who recognize the wink are called clairvoyants, and they have a connection to the author. The author has made a connection to them that if you didn't get the wink, you don't have that connection. And so it's an invisible means. In other words, it's not for everybody to see. It's by which queer perspectives find a voice in the heteronormativity media landscape. It could be a certain look on a character's face. It could be an expression of clothing in bright pink, if that's what's socially constructed for homosexuality. It could be gay chef as a hashtag, like one of my friends posts every time he posts a meal. That's a textual wink. You could look at it that way for a person who's being positioned as a fourth person, the fourth persona by the way that the media content has been constructed. So this now concludes our discussion of queer analysis. And I hope as you go throughout your day, you're considering some of these ideas and can find your own examples outside of our instructor video today. Have a great day.